he gets to hear the lectures. That's an excellent example. That would be an even harder drive than mine from Bangor to Berwick. So I've been thinking about the statehood era for quite some time. I sort of saw the bicentennial coming, really partly because a bunch of War of 1812 bicentennial events arose, and I hadn't really prepared anything for it, so I wasn't really able to take advantage of it. So that sort of led me to think more about the statehood era. I'm sort of a specialist in the American Revolution, and I think of that as sort of in the broader context, the last couple decades of the 18th century and into the 1820s. So the statehood era is really right at the center of my long-term research interests as a historian and faculty member at the University of Maine. And one of the things I often say when I start this talk, and since Brooke is coming from Pennsylvania, it adds to the story, is that I went to graduate school in Philadelphia, where I essentially trained as an early American historian who was dedicated to telling a different story of early American history that didn't just talk about New England all the time. So my dissertation and my first book sort of championed the Philadelphia area and explained why that was really important to understand. And then, of course, I got a job at the University of Maine, and I've had my comeuppance. I've spent the last 20 years trying to make up for the sort of regional distortions of where I trained as a historian in graduate school. So in a lot of ways, a talk about the bicentennial of the state of Maine is sort of the perfect end of that circle, where I've now invested myself and spent, a fair bit of time in archives looking at material from the period, read a lot of secondary literature to try to understand how other scholars have looked at the Maine statehood era. But the thing that really has been most interesting for me in this bicentennial year plus is the opportunity to come and to speak in so many local historical societies and public libraries all across the state. And I think the passion for history that is on display in these kinds of institutions, not just in Maine, all across the United States, indeed, all across the world, right? There is, I think, a fundamental human craving to understand where we come from and to place ourselves in some sort of context that is more than just the narrow egotistical focus on ourselves as individuals in our contemporary moment. So the issue that I pose with my title, and I guess this is a good point for me to start to share my screen. Let's see. I think I've got this right. All right, so that I think I gotta adjust one more thing, maybe more than one more thing. There we go. I can see some faces again. I think most of you can see the screen and maybe some faces as well. So the question I ask in my title tonight, Commemorating Maine Statehood, what did we learn from the bicentennial, really calls on us to think a little bit, or, for me to think a little bit about the distinctive way of thinking about the past, not as a historian necessarily, and not as a teacher, which are two of the other hats that I wear regularly, but how do we think about commemoration as a distinctive aspect of public history? So not what I'm trying to teach my students, and not necessarily the new kinds of knowledge I'm trying to create in my own original research, But what place does the bicentennial of statehood hold for something that we share in our collective civic culture? And so the image that I have on the screen is what I think is the most immediately recognizable icon of the Maine Bicentennial. And I suspect in an audience of many history buffs, many of you, like me, probably have this commemorative license plate on the front bumper of your car right now. We shelled out our $20 or whatever it was to the Maine Department of Motor Vehicles, and we get to take off our dull old regular plate and show our Maine state pride by having this as our front plate. And I think we get to keep it up for a whole nother year. I think that's one silver lining of the pandemic. We're not supposed to take it down right now, but we get to cheat and keep it on our cars into 2021. Now, one of the things the license plate does, I think, implicitly, is it puts these 2 years in relationship to one another, 1820 and 2020. And the fact that we celebrate a bicentennial, you know, is just sort of an accident that we have 10 fingers and we count by tens and we count by decades and centuries, right? There's nothing really profound just in being a bicentennial, except that it's part of our number system. Now, I'm very appreciative for this resonance because I do think we live in a very present-minded and even future-obsessed culture right now, where we very rarely have something as old as 200 years ago kind of bubble up into public consciousness. So it's a really nice opportunity for me to have a sort of hook to talk about early American history with a broader group of like-minded history lovers. But I think the question that I want to really make the center of my talk tonight is, what is this relationship between 1820 and 2020? I mean, other than it being a nice round number in a bicentennial, are there connections that we can draw across this large period of time? And this is really going to structure my talk. I'm going to focus on 3 themes that I think do show a really powerful connection between issues that were really pressing in the long statehood era that we also, I think, will all recognize as being aspects of Maine society and American society in the 21st century that are also still with us. And for me, balancing and thinking about this relationship between the past and the present is the most exciting thing about history, right? Memorizing a whole lot of dates and facts is not exciting, right? It's some of the obligation of doing good history. But thinking about what themes endure and also what changes, and how do we balance persistence and continuity with change and disruption on the other hand, that I think is a really fascinating issue, and one that I hope to share and talk a bit about in the question and answer after I sort of explore these 3 long-term connections that are going to structure my talk. So let me just turn to the most basic facts about statehood. I think all of them probably totally well known by this point, as we maybe are suffering a bit of bicentennial fatigue as we're now past the official completion of our bicentennial year. But Maine became the 23rd US state on March 15th, 1820. We've got a very distinct birthday, right? A legal moment of creation as an independent state. And I pair this most basic fact of Maine statehood with a map by Moses Greenleaf, who is a wonderful Maine cartographer and surveyor. The Osher Map Library has a really spectacular collection of Greenleaf maps. If you're not familiar with it and you're a map buff, you should, at the very least, check out the Osher Map Library online. They are part of the University of Southern Maine. They're a public institution. The public is welcome to use and look at their original material, but they also do a terrific job digitizing and putting their material online to share with the broader public. And I think of this Moses Greenleaf map from 1820 as the first official map of the state of Maine. Now, I've been told that that's actually not accurate. It was not an official map. It was not sort of sanctioned by the state, but we can see he identifies it in the bottom right-hand corner as the state of Maine, no longer the Eastern District or the Maine District of Massachusetts. And roughly speaking, what he depicts there is how we tend to imagine the basic shape of Maine even into the 21st century. So that is my starting point, basic sense of time and place. And I'm going to actually set my timer because, like many professors, I like to talk too long. I want to try to make sure I don't wear your patience. And I do really want to have a discussion and get your comments and questions. So I hope to work through my 3 past-present connections in the space of about 30 minutes from now, and then turn to Q&A, and we can go back and look at slides that are interesting to you again, or talk about anything that interests you. So I want to start my first past-present connection with what I am pretty sure is the most famous aspect of Maine statehood. And I have to say, it's also one that is kind of complicated and a little bit confusing. And I did not really understand the Maine-Missouri crisis until I really took it upon myself to become a sort of bicentennial speaker and realize, well, I really got to figure out what the heck is going on with this very striking event. And I think it is a little bit of a puzzle. Maine in 1820, just like Maine in 2021, does not have a large population of people of African descent. So how is it that Maine's admission to the United States helped to trigger the most significant, most dramatic, largest political crisis over slavery in the early republic? There is some heavy lifting to do to explain how this could be, why this could be, and how do we make sense of it. So the image that we have here is a pretty classic one that appears in just about every, some version of it appears in just about every single US history textbook, whether it's written for high school students or college students. And, the basic thing it wants to point out to us is that Missouri came in as a slave state in 1821. Maine was admitted as a free state in 1820 as part of this complicated resolution to a national political crisis that led Washington to really come to a standstill over this issue. They also drew this compromise line so that north of that line, no new states would be allowed to have slavery, with the exception, of course, of Missouri. Right? That is sort of the basics of the package that resolved this national crisis. Now, as I learned more about this event, I came to think that there were two somewhat serious errors in this map. And the first of them was pointed out to me the very first time I gave one of these bicentennial talks, which I think was in the summer of 2016. And someone's hand shot up, and this woman said, you know, when I went to high school in Maine, we did not call it the Missouri Compromise. We called it the Maine-Missouri Compromise. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of funny. I think she's right? Maine is not getting its proper due in the way that this particular textbook describes this event. But the second error that I see in this map is one that's a little bit more substantial, and that has to do with the use of the word compromise to describe the resolution of this conflict. And I no longer think it is really appropriate or accurate to call this resolution a compromise. And to explain why that is, I need to dig a little bit deeper into exploring how did this explosive national crisis come about. So after a long period of multiple votes, Maine voters, by a decisive majority, said they wanted to become independent from Massachusetts. And this was through a process that the Massachusetts legislature had set up. So they then moved on to a constitutional convention. They draft a constitution for the proposed new state. And then that constitution is transmitted to the US Congress in Washington, D.C. with a request for Maine statehood. Now, here is the first of our many connections. When that application for Maine statehood arrived at the US Congress, the Congress was in an absolute deadlock, partisan gridlock, no discussions, no conversations, no way to resolve the political impasse of the day. And right away, the Maine US congressman realizes that Maine statehood is in real trouble. So one of the US congressmen from Maine in 1820 is a guy named Mark Langdon Hill. He's from Phippsburg, and he writes a letter back to William King, who is, of course, the great leader of the Maine statehood movement and will be the first governor of the independent state. Hill writes to King in December of 1819, and he is writing with a warning. And he says to King, we need to make sure that people in Maine do not cause a fuss if we are going to actually achieve Maine statehood. And in particular, he says, we should, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And he adds a PS in this letter. I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slavery question. So what had happened was that Missouri had applied to become a state about 12 months before Maine did. And when Missouri applied to become a state, a member of the House of Representatives from New York entered a bill that said that is fine, but the US Congress will prohibit Missouri from allowing slavery to be a legal institution. And that bill passes in the US House of Representatives. It gets forwarded to the Senate, and in the Senate, it becomes an enormous hot potato. So this has ground national politics to a standstill over the course of 1819. And then the Maine petition for admission as a state comes, and it is clear that it is going to get embroiled with whatever is going on in Missouri. So I have a great quote from the Eastern Argus, the Maine Republican newspaper in Portland from January of 1820, where it's reporting on what's going on in the US Congress. And I think it gives a great sense of the intensity, the passion, and also, again, the frustratingly recognizable way that this was a irresolvable political conflict that politicians could not figure out a way to deal with. So the Eastern Argus reported on January 25th, 1820, quote, "The debate on the Missouri question has at last commenced in the Senate, and it absorbs so much attention that until it is indefinitely settled, it may almost be said that no other business will be done in Congress. Never were the galleries and lobbies more crowded." So this is the impasse that is the bottleneck of national politics. Now, a complicated series of negotiations begins, put together by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is, of course, from Kentucky. It is kind of a very similar demographic profile to Missouri, an upper South state, a Western state, a place where there's slavery, but also not completely dominated by large plantation economies of the Deep South. So Henry Clay is pretty sympathetic to the desire of pro-slavery Missourians to enter the state as a place where slavery is legal. And Clay puts together a very complicated package of multiple bills that will allow both states to enter, with the addition of this line to prohibit slavery to the north. Now, where this story gets particularly interesting and how it connects powerfully to Maine politics is that the vote that goes forward on the critical question passes the House of Representatives by only 3 votes. 90 in favor of allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state, and 87 against. Now, what gives us our main hook is that the congressional delegation from Maine played a decisive role in this very narrow passing of this pro-slavery bill that would allow slavery as a legal institution in Missouri. And again, it is on the narrowest of margins. So it might shock you to discover that in the US Congress in 1820, Maine had 7 US congressmen. That's just from the District of Maine that is still part of Massachusetts. The population was big enough then that we had 7 US congressmen. And those congressmen voted strongly against the admission of Missouri as a slave state. The majority of the Maine delegation voted, in a sense, against Maine statehood because they said it was not acceptable to them for Maine to become a state if it included the expansion of slavery to Missouri. So 5 of those 7 US congressmen from Maine voted against the act, and only 2 voted in favor. But those 2 were exactly the margin that was needed. If those 2 had voted with their colleagues in the majority, we would not have had the resolution of the conflict that led Maine to become a state. Now, what's interesting to me, then as now, when politicians are forced to take a stand on a really difficult question that divides the nation so explosively, they tend to need to explain to the public why they took the stands that they did. So we've got newspaper letters jointly written by both sides explaining, here is why we took the stand that we did. So I want to read to you part of the language of the group of 5 US congressmen in the majority in the state, but who lost in the national vote, explaining why they opposed the resolution of the Maine, Missouri crisis in a way that allowed slavery to expand to Missouri. They explained that they were afraid that slave power was going to corrupt Republican government. And they added that it was abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity to allow slavery to expand. And here is the real nub of this letter for me. They stated that it was a falsehood to call this a compromise. We utterly protest against and refuse to sanction it with our approbation, right? This is not a compromise. We did not agree. We did not bargain to this. We were defeated against our will by the narrowest of margins, and we still consider it a moral and ethical failure that we refuse to sanction with our approval. Now, I want to move on to my next connections, but I will just plant a seed for a possible question for later. And that is the letter on the right here is written by John Holmes, who was one of the 2 pro-slavery advocates on this vote. And John Holmes is from nearby Alfred, Maine, and is sort of a crucial player in the Maine statehood process. So we could talk a little bit more in the Q&A about how Holmes explained his defense. He's got a really close relationship with Thomas Jefferson, which is kind of interesting. But if I start talking about that, I'm going to use up all of my time, and we're never going to go beyond the Maine, Missouri crisis. So let's put that one aside for a moment with this final thought. What I think is most illuminating about understanding the Maine, Missouri crisis is that it shows us the importance of Blackness in American political life, even in a state like Maine that does not have then nor now a large population of people of African descent. And the power of Black politics in US national political culture then and now is a clear legacy of the incredible importance of slavery at the very center and as a foundation of American history. Now, I want to turn for my second past-present connection to expand our chronology a bit beyond just the moment of the March 15th, 1820 birthday party and the searing conflicts of 1819 to 1821 in this clash between Maine and Missouri. Because in a lot of ways, that is just to look at the very end point of what was a much longer struggle for Maine statehood. So the campaign for the District of Maine to separate from Massachusetts begins at least in the mid-1780s. We've got the first sort of conventions meeting to talk about these things. In fact, there was a Berwick representative in the 1786 Separation Convention, a guy by the name of Dr. Nathaniel Lowe. I'd be very curious if any local history buffs know more about Nathaniel Lowe that you could share with us in the question and answer period. And that's 1786, right? That's almost a decade before the first of the 6 sanctioned separation votes, where the Massachusetts legislature acknowledged that there were calls for Maine to become an independent state. And so the legislature set up some rules for a vote to determine if this question should go forward. So the first of these votes is in 1792. The last of them, the successful one, is in July of 1819. And what these maps show are color-coded by county, the degree of support in the popular vote in favor or opposed to separating from Massachusetts. So in this map, purple areas are places that support separation and the independence of the state of Maine, and green are areas that were opposed to separation. Now, if we look quickly at York County, we can see that York is opposed in the first 3 votes through 1807. And then in May of 1816 has a pretty strong support. And then for the final 2 votes, it moves back to this lighter color, more tepid support. And I'm going to, again, kind of move through this slide. I can talk for a long time about some of the wrinkles here that I think are interesting, but I will wait to see if I get questions about that to dig a little deeper. But I guess there are 2 things I want to say about this large map before we move on. And one is that in a lot of ways, the final vote in 1819 is kind of boring. Every county has a majority in favor of independence. The narrowest margin is in Hancock County, but even there it's 52%. You know, if everyone agrees that there's not a whole lot to talk about there. What is more revealing than that map, I think, are that we do not see each of these maps getting a little more purple, a little more purple, a little more purple over time. We actually see some very jagged changes and kind of back and forth. And so the very middle vote in 1807, that is actually the low point of the Maine statehood effort. There's only 1 county in the whole state in 1807 that gives a vote in favor of, or a majority vote in favor of independence. And I think this is kind of surprising to people in Maine today, right? We are familiar with the idea that Mainers might be annoyed by people from Massachusetts. And we would think if given the choice, Mainers would embrace becoming an independent state and severing that kind of connection. How could it possibly have taken 6 different votes and decades of argument and disputation dating all the way back to the 1780s? So this is a reminder that sometimes our present day expectations can be very misleading. Right? It is a puzzle to us that this could have been a hard or difficult choice, right? We would think it would have been 1 vote, 1 and done, and you'd have Maine happily disconnected from Massachusetts. Now, the last thing I'll say before I move on, this 1807 low point for the separation movement is a fascinating one. And my explanation for it actually has a Berwick connection. So in 1807, one of the candidates running to be governor of Massachusetts was a Berwick native. So John Sullivan, born and raised in Berwick, goes on to become an attorney in other parts of York County. He's then Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts. And he actually won the gubernatorial election in 1807 to become governor of Massachusetts. And it's a quite interesting election because he is the first Jeffersonian elected governor of Massachusetts. It's kind of a shock. Massachusetts has been a real Federalist stronghold. So that is part of my explanation for why there was such weak support for Maine independence in 1807, because at the same time, Mainers were voting for a person from Berwick to become governor of Massachusetts, right? So there'd be kind of a disconnection. If you're voting for him to be governor and you're withdrawing from the state, somehow I see those working at cross purposes with one another. But maybe we'll talk about that again in the Q&A a little bit later. I want to shift gears away from this statewide map with the county level data. And in a lot of ways, that kind of classic image of the state of Maine that we're looking at right now is very misleading, right? It suggests that Maine stretches all the way to the northern border. And the way that I color the counties on this map suggests that there are people voting in all of those areas of the state of Maine. And that is not at all accurate. So I want to share a historical map with you, which is my favorite Moses Greenleaf map, which he made in 1829. And this map shows, in fact, he titles it, the map of the inhabited part of the state of Maine. And he color codes it based on years of settlement. So the blue areas of the map were settled by English speakers by the time of the American Revolution. The red areas of the map were settled by the time of the presidential election of Jefferson in 1800. And the yellow areas of the map were settled by statehood in 1820. So obviously, Berwick is in the bottom corner here, the longest settled part of the state of Maine by English speakers. And in that sense, local developments in Berwick are not really changing over the course of this long statehood era. But for other parts of the state, there are significant changes with the gradual and really post-Revolutionary War boom of English-speaking settlement down east and into interior parts of the state. However, even as late as 1820, the people who were voting on the question of Maine statehood were really limited to a thin band along the coast and some deeper settlement areas that mostly follow major rivers into the interior. Now, I want to turn to a hyper-local glimpse at what's going on in Berwick in this era. And I'm going to just present this quite quickly, and we can come back to it and talk about it more. And I really hope that local history buffs are going to be able to share with us some of their observations about what's going on here and who some of the key actors are. But I have just listed here the local votes in Berwick and then in South Berwick, starting in 1816, on this 6 popular votes should Maine separate from Massachusetts. And as we see, there is just considerable opposition to this as the correct decision, right? lopsided opposition in 92 and 97, no return in that vexing 1807 vote. That's the worst turnout ever for the pro-separation forces. And then, you know, we've got this funny thing in 1816 with 2 votes in the same year. I can explain a little bit more about that if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. But what is particularly interesting in the 2 1816 votes is that they get much better turnout for the second vote in 1816. And when they get better turnout, they get a much stronger opposition to separation vote. And that's true at the local level in Berwick and South Berwick, but it's even more decisively true at the statewide level. And then even in the final vote of 1819, that's so boring on a statewide level, 72% of Maine voters favored separation in 1819, but not in Berwick, right? Berwick wanted to stay part of Massachusetts. And, you know, the simplest answer for this is just a matter of geography, that it would be easier to get from Berwick to Boston than from Berwick to Portland. But I would love to hear more about your thoughts of why Berwick was one of these standout communities that voted so strongly and so consistently against separation. Now, another aspect of zeroing in on the local politics of Berwick, and I hope that I am speaking to the right crowd here of old Berwick Society, Historical Society members who love local information, is I took a look in the published minutes of the Constitutional Convention, which you can download from the Fogler Library. They've scanned the whole thing. If you're curious, you can figure out that ridiculous HTML code. But just Googling Jeremiah Perley debates resolutions should bring it up on your computer. And here were the delegates from your local area who represented York County at the Maine State Constitutional Convention that met in November and December of 1819, a couple of months after that decisive vote in favor of separation. So we've got 3 people from Berwick, 2 of them with the last name Hobbs, Benjamin Green, prominent judge from South Berwick, 2 representatives from Lebanon, and 2 from Sanford. And the 3 bottom names on the list are in italics because they refused to sign the state constitution that was negotiated at this convention. And there were a fair number of people who took this position, but this is, to look in your local area and just say, basically 1/3 of the representatives to the state constitutional convention could not bear to put their name on the document that they were sending out to a public vote is pretty striking. And this is another symbol for us of the real serious misgivings that people in the Berwick area had about the dangers of separating from Massachusetts, and that this might not be a good thing for people from this area. I've got a little more I could share about some of those individuals, but I am mindful of my time. I'm just checking my stopwatch. I've already exceeded my claimed limits, but I am going to do one more past-present connection. And this is another issue that was really pressing in the statehood era and is also really strongly with us in the early 21st century as well. And this is to ask the question, what did Maine statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? So if Maine is becoming a new sovereign entity, a government that is the source of authority and power, I think we also need to ask ourselves, what were the consequences of that for sovereign Wabanaki nations who are also in this region and who, of course, have been here for millennium prior to the arrival of Europeans? So this map from the Portland Press Herald does a nice job of reminding us of the extent of the Wabanaki homeland, not just in Maine, also in Vermont and New Hampshire, not just in the United States, also in multiple provinces of modern day Canada. So this is a really burning question. Again, not just in contemporary politics in 2021, when Wabanaki issues are in the news on a regular basis, but also for politicians and public life in the statehood era as well. Now, in answering this question as succinctly as possible, and we could spend a lot of time thinking about it, I think we need to balance two ways of thinking about Wabanaki people's relationship to the creation of the state of Maine. And I want to start by talking about some of the perils, the way in which Maine statehood was a direct threat to Wabanaki individuals, Wabanaki communities, and to Wabanaki sovereignty. There is no question that the statehood of Maine accelerates Wabanaki dispossession, intensifies colonization, and leads to a growing loss of life among Wabanaki people. Now, one way to measure this is to think about Native American voting rights. So Native Americans will not be granted federal voting rights in the United States until a federal law of 1924. And that in itself is pretty shockingly late. But because of the US federal political system, the law governing federal voting rights does not impact state voting rights. And Native American people in Maine will not get the right to vote in state elections until 1954. That is the second to last state in the US to do so. So that is, just one way of pointing out the degree of dispossession and exclusion from citizenship that Maine statehood brought and that would persist into the second half of the 20th century. Now, I don't think it is enough to only focus on the perils and indeed the catastrophe for Wabanaki people that Maine statehood brought. And the chief reason I say this is that if all we do is think about Indigenous people as victims and as being crushed by colonization, we reinforce one of the most misleading elements of colonialism, and that is the idea that Indians are always going to disappear. And so I think we need to balance our sense of these perils and these difficulties and these challenges with a recognition of the extraordinary way in which Wabanaki people and communities and sovereign nations responded to this threat in ways that allow them to continue to survive and indeed to have a population recovery in the 20th century, so that we see very active Wabanaki contributions to Maine public life in the 21st century. So my children and my grandchildren will recognize Wabanaki people as living actors in Maine society more than my parents and grandparents did. Right? This is the long arc of Wabanaki persistence. And I am particularly interested in how this Wabanaki struggle expressed itself during the statehood era itself. And I think there are two really extraordinary aspects of Wabanaki history that are often overlooked, that really do point to their remarkable resilience and strategic positioning in order to respond to this grave challenge. So the first of these two is that the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy in particular have retained a continuous and unbroken and officially recognized sovereign control over some portion of their traditional homeland. And I believe that they may be the only two Native American groups in the United States east of the Mississippi River who can make that claim. I might be wrong, but I am pretty sure that this is a signal achievement for Native American groups in the US east of the Mississippi. And a second remarkable example of this political effectiveness is that there were Penobscot tribal delegates to the Maine legislature in 1823. And it's practically the first meeting of the Maine legislature. And they recognized that there was an official Penobscot delegation that had a right to participate in those meetings of the legislature. And that Penobscot delegation was joined by a Passamaquoddy delegation in 1842. And those two were joined by the Holton Band of Maliseets in 2010. Now, it's clear that these strong political statements and this control of a portion of their tribal homeland were both limited and fractured successes, right? When we were talking about tiny, tiny bits of what had been a much larger Penobscot and Passamaquoddy homeland. And these tribal delegates to the Maine legislature, starting in 1823, and indeed to the present day, are officially recognized, but they do not have the right to vote as members of the legislature, right? So I'm not, how do we balance the perils and the persistence, right? Even the successes are marked in and hedged in by some notable limits. But for me, that is really one of the crucial things to try to balance. How do we both acknowledge the threat and danger and also recognize the accomplishment and the ongoing presence of Wabanaki people in their traditional homeland. So that is the wrap up of my talk.